Imagine it is the year 1576. You're a gravedigger on a small island in the Venetian lagoon. For weeks the plague has been ravaging the city. Every day dozens of corpses are brought to you, wrapped in linen shrouds, stacked in open pits like firewood. The stench is unbearable, and you've stopped counting the dead a long time ago. Today you have to reopen one of the older graves to make room for fresh bodies. As you shovel the earth aside and expose the top layer of cloth, you see something that makes your blood run cold. One of the corpses, a woman, does not look like the others. Her body is bloated, nearly twice the size as it was at the time of burial. Her lips are red, and the shroud that was supposed to cover her face, it's torn. The fabric hangs in tatters around her open mouth, as though she had been chewing on it, as though she had been eating her way through. You know immediately what this means. This is no ordinary dead woman. This is a Nachzehrer. And as long as this creature feeds in its grave, the people around you will keep dying. You reach for the only thing at hand, a brick, and press it between the dead woman's jaws.
Tick, tick, down the hall. Great tales, call it by name. Great tales, shadows remain. Tick, 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 time keeps its stare. Great tales, something is there.
Hello and welcome to Great Tales. My name is Chris and I'm glad you're back. There is a particular kind of undead in German folklore that is unfortunately neither elegant nor seductive. No cape, no fangs, no aristocratic castle in the Carpathians. This undead lies in its grave and eats. First its shroud, then its own fingers, its hands, its arms. And with every bite it takes, someone on the surface grows a little weaker, a little paler, a little closer to death. It's called the Nachzehrer, and for centuries it was one of the most feared figures in German-speaking folk belief. What exactly is a Nachzehrer? The name is composed of two parts, nach in the sense of after death, and zehrer from zehren, meaning to feed, to consume. A Nachzehrer is, quite literally, someone who continues to feed after death. Some sources also play on the proximity to Nacht, the night feeder, the one who eats in the dark. The term itself does not appear in literature until the 19th century, but the belief in what it describes is considerably older, reaching back to at least the late Middle Ages. And there is hardly a German-speaking region that does not have its own variant of this creature. In northern Germany, the Nachzehrer was especially prevalent, but reports also came from Silesia, Bavaria and Franconia. And contrary to a long-held assumption in folklore studies, the belief was by no means limited to Slavic-influenced territories in the east. It extends as far as the Rhineland. In the Eifel region, where old cemeteries were cleared, skeletons were discovered that had been buried face down, a clear sign that the community had considered the dead person dangerous and wanted to prevent them from digging their way out of their own graves. What distinguishes the Nachzehrer from what we understand today as a vampire is fundamental. The classic vampire, as literature has shaped it since the 19th century, is a hunter. He rises from the grave, seeks out his victims, bites them, drinks their blood. The Nachzehrer does none of that. He's a passive destroyer. He lies in his coffin, he chews, and through a form of sympathetic magic, an invisible magical connection, he drains the life force from his relatives. Every time the dead man chews on his shroud, a living person grows weaker. The family withers away, one after the other, without knowing why. And this is what is truly disturbing about this myth. The Nachzehrer does not come to you. You don't notice he's there. You simply grow tired, pale, you cough, and then you die. And the only thing connecting you to death is a distant, wet smacking sound drifting up from the cemetery. Within the context of German undead traditions, the Nachzehrer occupies a very distinctive niche. He's a subcategory of the so-called Wiedergänger, the returning dead who threaten the living. But he differs fundamentally from other Wiedergänger types. The Aufhocker, for example, another figure from German folk belief, leaps onto the backs of nighttime wanderers and grows heavier and heavier until the victim collapses under the weight. In the Rhineland, the Aufhocker could even take the form of a werewolf. The Nachzehrer, by contrast, needs no physical contact at all. He works from a distance, telepathically, like a sympathy charm. He doesn't even have to get up. How do you become a Nachzehrer? In the folklore, there are several ways a person can become a Nachzehrer after death, and none of them involve a bite. The Nachzehrer is not contagious. Its creation is tied to the circumstances of death, or sometimes even the circumstances of birth. The most common cause is suicide. In an era when Christian doctrine regarded self-destruction as mortal sin, people who have taken their own lives were considered cursed. Their souls found no rest, and their bodies became something else. An unnatural or sudden death, an accident, a drowning, could produce the same effect. The underlying assumption was, anyone who dies in an unnatural way has a soul that is not ready to leave, and what remains is hungry. Particularly feared was the first person to die in an epidemic. When the plague swept through a village and carried off one family after another, the first to die was often declared a Nachzehrer in retrospect. He was the trigger, the invisible engine behind the mass dying. Not the rats, not the fleas, not the bacteria, of which of course nothing was known yet, but an undead in his grave, whose chewing was pulling the disease into the world of the living. In Bavaria, there was yet another path. Anyone born with a so-called caul, remnants of the amniotic membrane over the head, was prophesied to become a Nachzehrer after death, especially if the caul was tinged red. What was normally considered a sign of good fortune became in this context a foretelling of the curse. There was also a further reason, one that feels almost bureaucratic. If the dead person's name was not removed from the burial clothes, that too could turn them into a Nachzehrer, as though the identity of the deceased were the anchor binding them in the world of the living. As long as their name was still on the fabric, the connection was not severed. And a particular danger arose when the living had given the dead person personal belongings as grave goods, a piece of clothing, a personal object. This created a magical bridge between the grave and the former owner, across which the Nachzehrer could drain the life force. Before we continue, I have a small request. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave me a like and a comment too if you like it. I always love hearing from you. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But enough about that. Back to the story. The signs on the grave. When there was a suspicion that a Nachzehrer was at work, there was only one way to be certain. You had to open the grave. And the signs you were looking for were disturbingly specific. A Nachzehrer did not lie like a normal corpse. Its left eye was open. The thumb of one hand was clasped in the other, as though it were holding onto itself. The body was soft, not rigid, not decomposed, but strangely alive-looking. The lips were red, and the shroud, torn, perforated, partially swallowed. In some accounts, the dead had eaten through the fabric and had already been gnawing on their own hands and arms. If you listened near the grave, you could hear the Nachzehrer. The sources described the sounds consistently as smacking and grunting, similar to that of a feeding pig. Michael Renft, an 18th century Lutheran theologian and one of the most important chroniclers of the phenomenon, wrote that the sounds were like pigs grunting and feeding. This detail appears in reports from across northern Germany and Silesia. Always the same description, always that animal, revolting smacking beneath the earth. If you wanted to hunt a Nachzehrer, all you had to do was walk across the cemetery at night and listen. Wherever there was grunting, that's where they lay. The powers of the Nachzehrer. The core principle of the Nachzehrer is sympathetic magic. Through its chewing on the shroud or its own flesh, it drains the life energy of the living, above all, of its own family. The victims grow pale, exhausted, ill. They waste away. They die of a wasting sickness that looks like tuberculosis or plague, but has no discernible natural origin, at least not in the eyes of the people at that time. But the Nachzehrer can do more than just chew. In Kashubian tradition, it has the ability to shapeshift, and not like the classic vampire into a bat, but into a pig. In this form, it actually leaves the grave and visits its family to drink their blood. A vampire pig. It sounds absurd, but it is treated with complete seriousness in the sources. The pig is an unclean animal that roots in the earth and eats carrion. The symbolic connection is obvious. In some variants, the Nachzehrer in pig form doesn't even go hunting for humans, but uses the shape to scout the surroundings without drawing attention. And then there's an especially bizarre habit that appears in certain sources. The Nachzehrer is said to have braided the tails of cows together, which in turn caused cattle plagues and pestilence. Exactly how an undead was supposed to accomplish this without sending the cows into a panic, the sources elegantly decline to explain. Even more unsettling is another ability. The Nachzehrer can, accompanied by a woman who died in childbirth, rise from the grave and climb the church tower. There it begins to ring the bells, and everyone who hears the tolling dies. Imagine that for a moment. A village community in the 17th century, in the middle of a plague epidemic, and at night the church bells begin to ring even though no one should be up there in the tower. The panic this must have caused is almost unimaginable. And then there's the lethal shadow. If the Nachzehrer shadow falls upon a living person, that person dies. An undead that does not even need to be physically present to kill, whose mere silhouette brings death. The countermeasures. But people were not defenseless against the Nachzehrer. Over the centuries, concrete defensive and offensive measures developed, often beginning at the moment of burial itself. The simplest method was to place something in the dead person's mouth to prevent them from chewing. A stone, a clod of earth beneath the chin, a coin between the teeth. In some regions, a cloth was tied lightly around the dead person's neck so they could not open their mouth. The logic was simple. If the Nachzehrer cannot chew, it cannot drain life force. No chewing, no death. But there were also more drastic precautions. In the Eifel and other regions, the body was buried face down, so that the undead, if it tried to dig its way out of the grave, would only work itself deeper into the earth instead of reaching the surface. A simple but remarkably clever idea. Elsewhere, a net was placed in the coffin. The idea behind it? The Nachzehrer had to untie every single knot before it could leave its grave. 1 knot per year. This bought the living time. Following a similar logic, a bag of sand or seeds was sometimes placed in the coffin. The Nachzehrer, it was believed, had to count every single grain before it could become active. Obsessive counting as vampire defense, a motif, incidentally, that has survived into modern pop culture, from Eastern European folktales all the way to the Count on the Sesame Street. The official method of permanently destroying a Nachzehrer was twofold. First, a coin in the mouth to paralyze it, then decapitation. The head was separated from the body, and with that, the connection between the undead and its family was severed. In particularly severe cases, the body was additionally staked or burned. The relatives across the border. The Nachzehrer was not an isolated phenomenon. Beyond Germany's eastern border, in the Kashubian communities of northern Poland, there existed a closely related creature called the Vjesci, which bore almost identical traits, and whose folklore adds to its own fascinating details. The Kashubians are a West Slavic ethnic group in Pomeria, on the Polish Baltic coast. Their culture is distinct, their language a separate Slavic language, and their traditions carry traces of pre-Christian belief systems. And their vampire lore was particularly elaborate. The Vjesci was, according to Kashubian tradition, destined to become a vampire from birth. The identifying mark? A caul, the amniotic membrane that covered the child's head at birth. To avert the fate, the caul was preserved, dried, ground to powder, and fed to the child on their 7th birthday. If the ritual was performed correctly, the curse was broken. If not, then the community had a problem that would only become visible after the person's death. There was also the Vupci, a related creature that differed from the Vjesci in that the child was not born with a caul, but with teeth already in place. And unlike the Vjesci, the fate of the Vupci could not be averted. This child would become a vampire after death, and nothing could prevent it. Particularly noteworthy is a Kashubian burial ritual called the Push do Nok, the empty night. On the night before the funeral, members of the community gathered in the deceased's house and prayed. But it was not merely a morning prayer. During the ceremony, participants approached the laid out body one by one and examined it for signs that it might become a Vjesci, Vupci or Wiedergänger. Was the body unusually soft? Were the lips red? Were the bloodstains there to be found beneath the fingernails? The push to knock was, if you will, a final inspection, a quality check before burial, to make sure the dead would actually stay dead. If the signs were positive, if there was reason to suspect the dead person would return, the Kashubians resorted to the same measures known in the German territories. A crucifix or coin under the tongue, earth in the coffin, a net with knots, burial face down. And in the most extreme cases, decapitation. The blood that flowed from the wound during decapitation was then given to those who had already fallen ill, as a remedy. The parallelism between the German Nachzehrer and the Kashubian Vjesci shows how deeply the belief in the feeding dead was rooted in the culture of Central Europe. It was not a regional superstition, but an entire system of ideas that stretched across linguistic and ethnic boundaries, from the North Sea to the Baltic, from the Rhineland to Pomerania. The academic debate. What makes the Nachzehrer especially fascinating is that it was not merely the stuff of horror stories. It became the subject of a serious academic and theological debate that was conducted over decades at German universities. Martin Luther himself is said to have mentioned the Nachzehrer, and the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches from the late 15th century, arguably the most influential handbook for witch hunters, contains an account of a shroud-eating corpse. The idea that the dead chewed in their graves and thereby harmed the living was thus already part of the scholarly discourse long before the formal academic debate. The real catalyst came in 1679, when the Protestant theologian Philip Rohr publishes the Dissertatio Historico-Philosophica di Masticatione Mortorum at the University of Leipzig. In English, a historical philosophical dissertation of the chewing of the dead. Rohr even observed that the devil particularly liked to brand virtuous women as Nachzehrer in order to destroy their reputation posthumously. Because once a word spread that a dead woman was chewing in her grave, people began to doubt her virtue. She must have been a sinner. The devil was using the Nachzehrer, in other words, as a tool of slander. 46 years later, in 1725, the response came. Michael Renft, a young Lutheran theologian, delivered a lecture on the phenomenon at the same University of Leipzig and published his work, De Masticatione Mortorum in Tumulis, on the chewing and smacking of the dead in graves, in 1728. Renft was a rationalist. For him, the devil has nothing to do with it. He believed in a kind of vegetative soul that persisted in the body for a while after death and caused the chewing, a natural, not supernatural explanation. He advanced the idea of a natural magic that was neither divine nor diabolical, but belonged to a third, as yet poorly understood category. In his book, Renft collected dozens of case reports from across Germany and beyond. One of the best known concerned Heinrich, Count of Salm, who, after his supposed death, was buried in the Abbey of Auxerre. At night, screams were heard from the grave. When it was opened, the Count had gnawed the flesh from his own arms. He had been buried alive. Other cases in Renft's collection reached back as far as 1355. Renft also documented the regionally varying countermeasures: clods of earth under the chin, coins and stones in the mouth, cloth tied tightly around the neck. Renft's work appeared at the moment that truly ignited this debate. Just a few years earlier, in 1725, the case of Peter Plogoyovitz had become public in the Hungarian settlement of Kisolova, an alleged vampire whose body upon exhumation was found remarkably well preserved, with fresh blood on the lips. The villagers burned the corpse in the village cemetery, and the smoke rose into the evening sky above the small graveyard. The reports from Kisolova and later from the Serbian village of Medveda, where the military surgeon Johann Flückinger produced an official investigative report on alleged vampire cases in 1732, triggered a heated debate in the Leipzig scholarly circles about the existence of vampires. One that stretched over an entire decade, the so-called Leipzig vampire debate of 1725 to 1734. The Nachzehrer was then no mere fairy tale. It was an academic battleground. The finest minds of the age, theologians, philosophers, physicians, argued over whether the dead could chew in their graves, and if so, why. In the 1740s, even the Benedictine monk Augustin Calmet from Lorraine, one of the most prominent Catholic theologians at the time, took up the subject and devoted an entire treatise to vampires and revenants. The Venice find. And now we return to the scene from the beginning, because the story of the Nachzehrer is not only preserved in books, it has a face. In 2006, the Archaeological Superintendency of Veneto conducted excavations on the island of Lazzaretto Nuovo, a former quarantine station northeast of Venice. The island had been used for centuries as a mass burial ground for plague victims. Here lay the dead from the epidemics that struck Venice between the 15th and the 17th centuries. In one of the graves, dated to the devastating plague epidemic of 1576, the same epidemic that also killed the painter Tizian, the team led by forensic anthropologist Matteo Borini found the skeleton of a woman. She had been approximately 61 years old, came from humble circumstances. Her diet consisted mainly of grain and vegetables, and she had died of the plague. The scientists gave her the nickname Carmilla. But what was remarkable about this find was not her age or her cause of death. It was the brick lodged between her jaws. The position of the brick, according to Borini's analysis, was no accident. Someone had deliberately placed it after the woman was already dead. The body had not decomposed enough for the brick to have simply fallen in. The joints were still intact. This means that gravediggers, who had apparently reopened the grave to add fresh bodies, saw the bloated, red-lipped corpse, noticed the torn shroud, and concluded that this woman was a Nachzehrer. So they did the only thing they thought was right. They shoved a brick between her teeth. Borini described the find as the first archaeological evidence of an anti-vampire exorcism. Though, to be fair, there's also a counterposition. Other scientists, including the physical anthropologist Simona Minozzi from the University of Pisa, argued that given the amount of debris in the grave, stones, bricks, roof tiles, the brick could also have fallen in the open jaw by chance. They pointed to another find on the neighboring Vecchio Lazzaretto, where a skeleton had a femur bone in its mouth. Obviously not a ritual act, but an accident of grave dynamics. The debate continues to this day. What is undisputed, though, the find demonstrates the belief in shroud-eating undead was not merely a northern German phenomenon. It reached as far as Venice, into the plague pits of the Italian coast. The concept of the Nachzehrer, or a very similar creature, was evidently so widespread that gravediggers in a cosmopolitan city like Venice applied the same countermeasures as peasants in Silesia or Pomerania. And in 2024, scientists used 3D software to reconstruct the face of the woman, the vampire of Venice. More than 400 years after her death, she was given a face, and it is the face of a perfectly ordinary woman, a peasant, a worker who had the misfortune of being the first or among the first to die of the plague, and who was then declared a monster, simply because her body decomposed in a way that was frightening the living. The explanation behind the myth. And here the circle closes, because what the gravediggers saw when they opened the plague pits had an entirely natural explanation. They simply didn't know. When a person dies, decomposition begins immediately. Bacteria in the digestive tract, the same ones that help us digest food while alive, begin to break down the body from the inside out. In the process, gases are produced. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. These gases have no way out. The body bloats, sometimes to double its original size. The gas pressure forces fluid from the interior of the body outward, a dark, foul-smelling substance that forensic scientists call purge fluid. This liquid exits through the mouth and the nose. If a shroud is draped over the face, the fluid soaks through the fabric. The wet cloth grows heavy, sinks into the open jaw, and as the gas pressure forces the jaw further apart, the cloth tears. It looks as though the dead person had been gnawing at the fabric. At the same time, the skin contracts as it dries out. Nails and hair appear to grow. In reality, the shrinking skin simply exposes more of them. The lips retract and bare the teeth. And because blood pools in the lower lying parts of the body after death, the lips and cheeks can take on a reddish tinge. Rigor mortis dissipates after a few days. The body becomes soft and pliable again, and thus paradoxically appears more alive than it did immediately after death. So what the gravediggers saw when they opened the plague pit was a bloated body with red lips, exposed teeth, an open mouth and a torn shroud. To someone without any knowledge of microbiology or forensics, it looked as though the dead person were alive, as though it had been feeding. And the sounds? Decomposition gases escaping through constricted bodily openings can indeed produce noises reminiscing of moaning, grunting or smacking. For a superstitious peasant in the 17th century, walking past the cemetery at night, the proof was complete. And when you consider that these graves were always opened precisely when a new wave of plague brought fresh victims, that is, exactly when people were most desperate for an explanation of the mass dying, then it is not hard to understand why the belief in the Nachzehrer was so deeply entrenched. The dead looked alive, the living were dying. The connection was obvious. The Nachzehrer was, if you will, the medieval answer to a question that could not yet be asked, because the biology was not yet known. Why are we dying? Because the dead are eating us, from below, in the dark, piece by piece. Epilogue. Well into the early 20th century, belief in the Nachzehrer was alive in parts of Germany. In some regions, precautionary measures at burials were still being practiced long after bacteriology had already revealed the true causes of epidemics elsewhere. And among the Kashubians, who emigrated to Canada and the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, the traditions traveled with them. In the Kashubian communities of Ontario, the terms Vjesci and Vjesci were still in use, testaments to a belief that it had crossed the ocean. The Nachzehrer is not a glamorous undead. It has no castle, no lover, no tragic backstory. It lives in the dirt, in the dark, in the stench of decomposition, and it chews. And that is precisely what makes it so disturbing. It is not the fantasy of a romantic era. It is the fear of a society that did not understand death, but had to live with it every single day. That buried its dead and then had to watch as one after another of the living followed, without explanation, without cure, without hope. It is a reminder that the darkest monsters are not the ones that hunt at the moonlight. They are the ones you never see. The ones that lie beneath the earth, in the dark, and whose presence you know only because the people around you have started to die. And sometimes, on quiet nights, if you listen closely enough near the old cemeteries, you could hear it, a soft, wet smacking, just beneath the ground. And with that, we've reached the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the topic. Feel free to leave me suggestions in the comments. Some really interesting episodes have come out of these. Sleep well if you can, and take good care of yourselves. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I'll be back for you very soon. Yours, Chris.